Jag heter Erik Prytz, jag jobbar på Linköpings universitet och här på KMC. Jag har en delad tjänst, sitter på 2 stolar i 2 kontor. Så jag springer emellan, men det är tur att det ligger nära så man behöver inte springa så långt. Jag kommer också köra resten av min presentation på engelska för våra internationella gäster. So I will be talking about a research project that we have within the Modeling and Simulation Research Program here at KMC. That was one of the bubbles that Professor Vladic showed you this morning. And some of you might have wondered what is within that modeling and simulation, because it kind of sticks out, disaster medicine and then simulation. Where does that fit into the model? And no pun intended on that one. And of course, as Peter mentioned, talking about simulation as a means of testing the capabilities of a system. And it could be testing the search capacity. It could be testing civilian and military collaboration. And so how do we do that? So I will be starting by talking about what simulation is from a more academic perspective, and then bring it down to the concrete levels of, well, talking about the patients, essentially, and the dynamic patient model that we've been working on for some time now here at KMC. So again, being a bit academic, as I am at the university, I would be amiss if I did not actually go into the more formal definitions of what simulation is. Because simulation evokes a lot of mental images in people's heads. Some people see mannequins, some people see trainers, some people see computer programs, some people see VR environments in their heads when I say simulation, and especially simulation-based training. But essentially, simulation is this, in a very simple way. Any system that is believed or hoped to be similar enough to some other system such that we can study the one to learn about the latter. Okay? So we have the real system, the real world, the other system. That's the real world. Okay? And then we have the referent. That bubble represents the knowledge that we have about the real world. That could be expert knowledge. A lot of people out here are experts in your own domain. That's one piece of the puzzle. We have published scientific literature. We have course books. We have other experiences. We have learned from other events. That's the referent. That's all that we know about the real world. And then we have the model, the simulation that we're trying to build. First step is creating a model. And the model is a simplification and abstractions. A simulation is always a simplification of reality. Otherwise, it would be a replication. And then we design a simulator, which is the sort of the physical platform on which the simulation can run. And that could be a mannequin or it could be a computer program. And then we have the execution of this, and it generates behavior, and that is simulation. And then we can compare these two. We see the real world and the observed behaviors, and then the generated behavior in our simulation. Just like what Peter said, he took the real military-civilian collaboration and looked at the times from that, and then he compared it to the same thing in the Emergo train system. And he could then compare them and learn about the real world from the simulation. And bringing it down, what is the real world we're talking about? It's typically that up there. Those 3 blue light organizations that we call in Swedish, the police, rescue service, and ambulance, and of course others as well, but those are the traditional, the big 3. That we can capture in some sort of model. Emergo train system mentioned by Peter is one of them. That is a type of model of the reality, the accident scene. And of course, Emergo train system also goes the entire chain with transportation and at the hospital with definite care. And then Emergo train system, it's an analog system, and I will come back to that because that's an important point. So it's magnetic figures that you put on a whiteboard, and you have an expert that is moving those figures around, those patients or resources that are simulated. And the fact that they are plastic figures or paper figures on maybe with magnets on a whiteboard, that doesn't say much about the underlying model. That's just how we represent it. That's just the simulator. That's just the physical thing that we use to execute the behavior. The actual doing the thing at the whiteboard, that's the simulation, and that's where really the magic happens. Because the output from that can then be compared to the output from the real world, and we can then learn about one or the other. We can create scenarios in the simulated environment and say, can Region Östergötland, the County Council of Östergötland, manage this accident that we've just modeled with the resources available to us? And we can simulate and say yes or no. As an analog system, it has a lot of advantages that may not be immediately obvious. People may look at that and say, that looks pretty simple. It's like fridge magnets that I have at home that my kids play with. But it's really much more than that. And it has a lot of advantages in terms of, say, cost, hardware required. You don't require a computer or some fancy software. You just need a magnetic surface, really. So it's low cost. It's robust. It's not going to reboot on you. It's not going to have Windows updates in the middle of the simulation because it's plastic figures, printed, and they're there. They're physical. And they're also very easy to use for people. You don't have to train people in using the simulation tool. So if you want to train people on command and control at an accident scene, you don't have to train them in using the simulation tool before they can start training. They can actually just walk up and use this system. All that said, we have created a digital version as well, because there are some other advantages to a digital version. Now this is called DigEmergo, and we've had a PhD student named Jonas Rybing who will be defending his dissertation later this spring, and I hope many of you will attend. I know at least two at least in this audience will attend, who is main advisor and on the committee. With the digital one, yes, it is more expensive. Yes, it requires hardware and software, and it is more fragile because it can fail and there may be bugs in the software. However, it allows other things. It has some advantages that still make it attractive, such as creating a distributed simulation environment. We can have people standing here at KMC with one view, and then we can have people at the hospital connected to the same server, training the same scenario at the same time, except we don't have to get people here. And we could connect people in Canada or Israel and do a joint scenario without moving people around. That's an advantage. We can also implement more strict rules on what they can do in this environment, and that's another advantage. A third advantage that I will be talking and spending most of my time on here is the possibility for dynamic behavior. With an analog system, it's static, and it's static for a reason, because they are printed figures, and you can't really update printed figures on the fly like this. So here's a chart of the heart rate of a patient in an DigEmergo trained system over time. Say this is patient 37, I'm just making this up, patient 37. Starting at time 0, patient 37 has a heart rate of 100. No matter how long you wait and look at that plastic figure, that number is not going to change because it's a printed figure, right? And that's all well and good. We can still create a valid simulation based on that. It's just a constraint that we have to live with in the analog environment. But what about the dynamics in a digital environment? Well, then we could have some development over time. We could have a patient whose heart rate updates over time, and that changes the game. We can do a different analysis of patient outcomes. In the DigEmergo trained system, we're talking about risk for death and risk for complications, because we don't know for sure that given how this patient was treated, he or she died or did not die. Why? Well, because it's static. We can only say that this was such a long time between the trauma incident and the treatment that there is a real risk that this patient would have died had he been a real patient. With a dynamic one, we might be able to get at that. Now, some of you may look at that and say, well, that doesn't look like a real heart rate. This is someone being stabbed, for instance. Is that how the heart rate would then just climb and keep climbing? In 50 minutes, it's at like 250 heart rate and then go on? No, that's not the point. Point is, we can create a model that can generate all kinds of behaviors, such that we can say, what about if we can apply a tourniquet 2 minutes into the scenario? Say that we actually create a model where we have trained everyone in Sweden and an accident occurs. And we can say, well, given that, this intervention, then this specific variable would then impact in this way. Or say that if we had another second trauma on this patient, how would that impact things, and so on. So that's the goal. We want to create a model that can generate a dynamic behavior on which we can then analyze systems, the real world. We want to learn about the real world. How do we do that? What is a good model of a patient? Let's start with a simpler question. What is a good model of a cat? What is the best model of a cat? It's a second cat, right? That would be the best thing. I mean, you get a lot of things for free if you just take another cat. And this is going back to 1945. Problem is, we can't really do that ethically. I cannot say the best model of a person suffering from a knife wound is to go and stab someone and see how that develops. That's not ethically sound. So we need some other way of creating our model. And what we've done is that we've gone through the scientific literature and textbooks like this for advanced trauma life support. And from lessons learned on those parts, we can start teasing out the relationship between physiological variables and trauma, and then capture those variables in a model. Okay? So in this case, we can focus on, say, the blood loss, which there are classifications for different stages of blood loss. Okay? And so up till 15% there's really no physiological indices that this has happened, and that's about as much as you donate a half a liter about when you go to Blodtappen and donate blood. And you don't really see much of an effect. You might get a bit woozy and have to drink some orange juice, but you're okay. But as you progress, you see that your heart rate changes and the breathing rate changes. And so if we just, in a very, very simple way, in a very simplistic way just to explain the concept here, we can see this little graph where we can say at 15% no effect, at 30% some effect, and so on. Well, that's just a linear, just a y equals kx plus m, right? Basic high school math. And we can say then, blood volume affects heart rate in this specific way, such that as the blood volume decreases, your heart rate will increase. Are there other things that will affect the heart rate? Yes, of course there is. There's a lot of things. Are there more to the human than blood volume and heart rate? I think so. I'm not a medical doctor, but I think we are more than just a bunch of blood and a pulse. And we're trying to add all that complexity into our model and create that. And essentially, what is a patient? It is the human being with all of the basic parameters that we're going to. We are all in here blue. We are persons. Let's hope the red one does not happen today, but I think during some demonstrations we will see what could happen if some of the red things happen to us. Then we would become the patient. We would have some sort of trauma, such as a bleeding. And we have the starting parameters and then the behavior over time. So there's a lot of things to include in this model. This is just, I've cropped the image because we have a lot of these little bubbles. We like the bubbles, right? We can see the heart rate, the blood volume, respiratory frequency, respiratory volume, airways, awareness, so the consciousness level, and so on. We have a lot of things to try to capture all that is the human being, or the patient in this case. And in this case, we've chosen to just visualize the output of this model. So we have the starting parameters, and then we said, let's stab this virtual model with a knife wound so that it starts bleeding. And this is sped up. This is another advantage of the digital environment. We can speed up time. So this is a sped up version. As the person is bleeding out, you see the heart rate changing. And that is not something we said at this time you should have this heart rate or this breathing frequency, which is changing now. No, we just said, here's the starting values. Add a bleeding. Let's see what happens. Where does this go? And he's still standing, but as he's losing blood, well, the consciousness should go down. So there, Glasgow Coma Scale to 8, he loses consciousness because he's not getting enough oxygen to the brain. So he's now sitting down instead of standing up, because as you're losing consciousness, you're not going to remain standing, and so on. Now he's laying down, and we're not doing anything. We could add a treatment, we could add a tourniquet or something to save this poor model, but we're just going to let him die instead after a certain time. And this, I think, was sped up so that 1 second in real time would be 5 or 6 seconds of simulation time, so it would be, but we could play with the times in that way. And that is just an example. The advantage is, of course, that we're not saying that at specific times you should have this thing. You could just say, starting injury, starting trauma, and then, oh, we applied a tourniquet after a minute. He would not have died. But there might have been other effects. You would still not get blood to the limb that you just cut off the circulation to. Well, we should model that as well and see that's a potential complication then. But if you go to the hospital within an hour, it's probably fine with the arm as well. So we have a conceptual model that we've implemented in our digital training and analysis tool, DigEmergo. And we're hoping to use this model to do additional system capabilities testing to see if this injury happens, if this trauma happens to 100 patients. And we have modeled the system, and we'll let the computer itself run itself a few hundred times. What is the outcome? The average outcome of 100 runs of accidents with slightly different input variables, so a stochastic simulation where some input variables are somewhat semi-random. It allows us to have a more fine-grained patient outcome measure where we can actually see it's down to minutes and seconds of treatments, not hours as in the current analog system. It enables different training. I'm not going to say that it's better. It's just different training. In this case, we could train people and they would have to re-triage people. You cannot trust that the triage you applied 10 minutes ago is still valid. So that's another thing that we could then train, because that's harder to train in the current analog system. And of course, as I mentioned, the large-scale simulation analysis. We're doing some initial verification and validation, so looking at seeing, well, is that real? Is that as it should be in reality? Is it valid? If we put the good data in, will we get good data out, or will we get garbage out? But the initial results are promising. when we're showing these simulations to medical professionals, they're saying that that behaves as I would expect a patient to behave. And that's one type of validation, a face validation, which we'll progress to. So that's all I had to say. Thank you.